The sermon this morning is entitled No Taillight, a three-part call to youthful spirits. Part 1, Birmingham. I woke up on that morning with quite a snarl on. My friend Lewis smiled at me, read the expression on my face, and said, "We better go get you some coffee." We walked over to the Waffle House next to the hotel where a gaggle of us had met late into the previous night, where we hung out and really got to know each other. When we got to the Waffle House, several of the other seminarians we were traveling with were sitting in a clump of tables together. For us, this Unitarian Universalist Service Committee sponsored intensive work-study program exploring the civil rights movement in Alabama and Georgia was the second half of a graduate-level class we were taking on the movement and its legacy. But once we actually got down south, our company was more than doubled and now included others who weren't here for credit. An older couple from Canada waved to us as they finished their breakfast. They just love to go on vacations which combine learning, travel, and service. The little pack of young people we were traveling with, several amazing teens led by two equally amazing young adults, popped into the restaurant to get something to eat. They were all giggly and sleepy-eyed, swapping stories and inside jokes. I started to feel more at ease with them around. Soon we got on the bus and headed into Birmingham, Alabama. I could feel a change coming over me once the bus started moving. Lewis must have picked up on it too, because usually I'm rather a happy-go-lucky sort. But today something was wrong. I was quiet. I was brief, almost terse. At first, I thought I might be getting sick with all the traveling, the early morning bus trips and the late nights drinking coffee. We were all trying to process everything we had read and seen, thought and learned, and there was much to process. We had been to Atlanta, we'd been to Montgomery and Selma in 4 days. And our next stop was Birmingham, Alabama. Bombingham is what they called it back in the day, 1963. When I realized what was really happening to me, I just lost it. We were on the way to the 16th Street Baptist Church where those 4 little girls were blown up and buried in the rubble of 16 sticks of hate one Sunday morning in 1963. Somehow, my consciousness had realized early something that I was only now catching up to. I had an 11-year-old girl at home. My oldest daughter was 11 years old then, the same age as Denise McNair, the youngest child killed on that September morning so long ago. So I lost it. Or rather, I realized that there was something I just couldn't process in that evil act. I couldn't ignore the idea that in some other place, in some other time, with a system that didn't favor people who looked like me, it could be my little girl that would never come home. I couldn't make sense of the hatred that provoked such a violent act on those 4 innocents, or visit upon the 3 children waiting for me back home. I broke down, and indecipherable sounds replaced the words I didn't have. They came gurgling out of me as I cried as hard as I have ever cried. Lewis was several seats away and couldn't get to me, and he didn't need to because the children came to console me. 18-year-old Giles, the young man who served as a chaperone for the youth, rubbed my back as a lovely teenage couple from Laramie, Wyoming, comforted me. He was soothing words and assurances that everything was all right and that my kids were fine. She, by pulling my head onto her shoulder and stroking my hair like I was her child. These young people didn't have to wait for the dozen or so future pastors of America that were on the bus to get to me. They didn't need any help or instruction. They were good kids naturally doing what was right. The civil rights movement was also filled with good kids doing what was right, most of whom didn't become famous, as Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and of course Denise McNair did when they were martyred on the morning of September 15, 1963. Many, like 14-year-old Carolyn Mall McKinstry, whose words I read earlier, had already taken a stand against the racism, against the hatred and institutional violence by braving the blast of fire hoses and the bite of police dogs in Birmingham, and others joined in. 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was doing the very same work by desegregating elementary schools in New Orleans, or the many young adult kids who at great risk to their bodies took a seat at whites-only lunch counters in South Carolina or Georgia or Tennessee, joined the Freedom Riders, or worked black and white together to sign up new voters among the African American population in Mississippi. Sometimes the kids had adult backup as well as training in nonviolent resistance. Some joined the movement to the surprise and chagrin of their elders. Some went to the protests as substitutes for parents who couldn't afford to risk losing their jobs. Families had to eat. As it was, freedom and inclusion were already 350 years overdue. Excuse me. It seems that one thing we can learn from the civil rights movement is that at its core it was a church-led youth movement. It is hard to say whether the African American churches that nurtured its leaders didn't look at their youth as the future of the church, but instead, perhaps they saw it as the present. Or whether these children simply became inspired by their elders and forced the moment to its crisis. For us, and for all churches wishing to teach justice or demand it, the youth cannot merely be looked on as cute and full of potential, but must also be seen as a powerful force capable of good work, creative action, and courageous deeds. Part 2, Selma. There was something about Selma that I found a little disturbing more than 40 years after the violence of the prolonged voter registration campaign there, of Bloody Sunday, and the murder of Unitarian minister James Reeb. The mood there seemed off. Perhaps it was just the heat of the day. I remember I took a picture of Lewis, an African-American man, arm in arm with our friend Ruth, a white woman of the South, as she was proud to say. It was the last time I saw the so-called races embracing each other, all the while we were there. During our short stay, we met the first African-American mayor of Selma, who, in a lengthy interview with us, hardly acknowledged there ever was racism in the town, never mind considering the possibility that it might still exist in some quarters. Perhaps it was the politician in him, unwilling to allow a negative into the conversation. Perhaps he, like so many others we met that week, wanted us to see what was happening now, not what happened then, what was happening now, and to look ahead at even better days to come. It was in Selma that I learned that one of Jim Reeb's murderers, who had long ago been acquitted by an all-white jury, was still alive. In fact, he owned a car dealership in town. The Reverend James Reeb came down to Selma, as did Keene, New Hampshire seminarian Jonathan Daniels and many other white clergy, when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. asked for help from people of goodwill. A young black advocate, a young black activist and church deacon by the name of Jimmy Lee Jackson had been murdered, and a memorial march from Selma to the Capitol building in Montgomery had been turned back by police on horseback. They had attacked the unarmed protesters with tear gas and beat them with clubs. Jim Reeb had come to Selma to help the marchers try again. On the evening of March 9th, 1965, him and two other Unitarian Universalist ministers were attacked by bat-wielding racists after leaving a black-owned restaurant together. Reverend Reeb was beaten so badly that he suffered a massive head injury and died a few days later. He was 38 years old. 36-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. offered his eulogy a few days later. The eulogy included these words: "Who killed James Reeb?" The answer is simple and rather limited when we think of the who. He was murdered by a few sick, demented, and misguided men who have the strange notion that you express dissent through murder. There is another haunting, poignant, desperate question we are forced to ask. It is the question, what killed James Reeb? When we move from the who to the what, the blame is wide and the responsibility grows. James Reeb was murdered by the indifference of every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safety and security of stained glass windows. He was murdered by the irrelevancy of a church that will stand amid social evil and serve as a taillight rather than a headlight, an echo rather than a voice. One has to wonder what he meant. Surely Dr. King, the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, couldn't have been talking about his church or those of the other ministers of the organization he served, many of whom had been themselves attacked, their lives and the lives of those they loved put into danger. He couldn't have been talking about churches like the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham that had helped to train children in that city to stand up to fire hoses and bomb blasts. By 1965, many young white people from churches and synagogues in the North had come to sign up voters and integrate buses headed to the South. Some of them were, like Reverend Reeb, killed. He couldn't have meant them. No, he didn't. He didn't mean churches and church people who stood up with the oppressed and demanded that they receive their basic freedoms. He meant churches and ministers that were perpetually waiting for some more convenient season. He meant churches that were just trying to keep the peace. He meant churches who felt they could literally separate themselves from the world until the kingdom of heaven came, evidently as a reward for looking the other way. He meant churches that were forever looking inward for sin when just beyond their doors, whole populations were being denied their rights. A race of people whose dignity and little children were being spit on, blown up, beaten back by clubs and set upon by dogs. He meant churches that wrung their hands when their young people went off to face angry mobs on behalf of others 1,000 miles away, but did not follow those children to Selma or speak out about civil rights from the pulpit or the safe and sacred space of coffee hour. Part 3, no taillight. In every church I have ever been involved with, as a member, a board member, student minister, I have found myself in animated discussion about young adults and their families. Perhaps you've had some, I don't know. The conversations usually take one of 3 forms. The first is something along the lines of, why don't young people come to church? The second conversation centers on, why don't they want to do church the right way? The third, why don't we see The Simpsons anymore? Since Bart started playing on the traveling baseball team, they've just stopped coming. Important questions indeed. But if we might learn something from the civil rights movement, perhaps it is our churches that should be questioned. For instance, how can churches make young people, families, and kids feel like they are at the center of church life, not sitting in the back of the bus? How do we pass on our traditions, principles, and community concerns without making people feel like they cannot move forward with us unless they have done time in the musty basement of our churches, rooting through news clippings of who we used to be, or checking off to-do lists we give them of things that may no longer matter? Have we ever considered that the Simpsons aren't coming anymore, not because of Bart's baseball foray, but because they wanted a church with a clear mission to the community? Some churches make hesitant, half-hearted attempts at engagement, but sidestep a full-on, united approach at lightening the ongoing burdens of the many suffering and struggling people that are always close by. Perhaps it is this fictitious example of The Simpsons. In this fictitious example of The Simpsons, they simply wanted a church that accepts the emerging ministry of the moment. Churches often struggle to find themselves when the world doesn't make their mission obvious, as it did for many churches during the civil rights era. Sometimes we get overwhelmed by the oppression of the multitude of equally important causes. Sometimes we let the perfect be the enemy of the good, waiting for some consensus on what we should do together. Sometimes we favor, or at least get caught up in, the other aspects of church life that also claim our time and need our attention: worship, spiritual growth and development, institutional maintenance. Sometimes we look at church as an escape from the real world rather than an entrance and reorientation to it. I know that you don't want to be members of an irrelevant church, a church that is a taillight rather than a headlight, an echo rather than a voice. So I trust you will keep doing the good work that is needed here, in your community, and wherever your congregation hears and heeds the call to service, justice, and healing division. As Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want. I imagine that you have found that the same is true of the sick, the outcast, the immigrant, the anguished, the addict, for those denied justice, and as well for those whose hearts of flesh have been turned into stone. You see, it's supposed to be the opposite way with religion. Our hearts of stone turn to flesh. Perhaps those people need our ministry most of all. So all of our congregations have a choice: to be a headlight or a taillight, a voice or an echo, a vital center for social justice, civil rights, and environmental action, or the safe house behind unbroken but stained glass. We can wait, watch, or do the work before us, along with our children who cannot wait to do good. For it is of such as them that the kingdom of heaven is made. So let it be, as it should be.